The church smelled of wax and lilies. Shadows flickered against the stained glass as mourners shifted in their seats, heads bowed, hands clutching tissues. My mother's coffin lay at the front, draped with white roses, and silence pressed down like a heavy curtain. I was 28 years old, my black dress clinging to me like armor, and though my throat trembled, I rose to sing the hymn she had always loved. My name is Anna Whitmore, and at that moment I believed that a single song could honor her memory. My voice lifted thin at first, but then grew steadier, threading through the hush. I could see tears sliding down the cheeks of old neighbors, my mother's friends from the library guild, even strangers who had simply known her kindness. For a moment, I forgot the weight of grief, forgot the cold stare of my stepfather in the second pew. I thought maybe, just maybe, this song would be a bridge to peace. But peace was not what waited for me. From the corner of my eye, I caught Charles Whitmore's jaw tighten the way he gripped the pew so hard his knuckles blanched. 52 years old, a man who thrived on control, who had worn a mask of respectability for decades. He had never liked my singing. He said it was frivolous, distracting, unnecessary. And at my mother's funeral, when I dared to let my voice rise for her, he decided it was a personal insult. The last note faded into silence, and before I could sit down, Charles stood abruptly. His polished shoes scraped against the stone floor, the sound harsh and startling. He muttered something under his breath about ruining the ceremony. Then, in one swift move, he clamped his hand around my arm. The congregation gasped. He dragged me toward the back doors, his grip iron, his face contorted with rage. I tried to speak, to tell him to stop, but the words died in my throat as he shoved me into the chill of the evening air. The cemetery was only steps away. Dark earth, freshly turned candles flickering in the wind. He turned on me with fury that had been simmering for years. His fist crashed against my shoulder pane, exploding down my side. I stumbled, breath knocked out the gravel, tearing at my knees. He shouted that I had embarrassed him, that I had made a spectacle. Each word was punctuated with another blow, my ribs screaming, my vision blurring. Cold night air mixed with the copper taste of blood at the corner of my mouth. In that moment, I was not just grieving my mother. I was fighting to breathe under the weight of a man who believed dominance was his right. The sound of his anger echoed across the gravestones, a grotesque contrast to the sacred quiet of the funeral. My stepsister Clara appeared in the doorway, her black dress elegant, her posture relaxed as if she were at a cocktail party instead of her stepmother's burial. She did not move to stop him. Instead, she leaned against the frame, folded her arms, and let a smirk spread across her lips. 26 years old, her father's mirror image in cruelty. When Charles struck me again, Clara laughed softly, the sound slicing colder than the night wind. She sneered, her eyes glittering with contempt, as if my pain was entertainment. The betrayal stung more than the bruises blooming under my skin. My mother's coffin lay only yards away, and yet her daughter by marriage delighted in my suffering. I wanted to scream at her to remind her that the woman we buried had once loved us both, had once tried to build a family. But Clara only tilted her head and whispered audibly enough for me to hear, pathetic. The word burned. Rage and humiliation churned inside me hotter than the pain. Charles lifted his hand again, but then something shifted. From the corner of the graveyard, I saw a tall figure step from the shadows. He wore a long, dark coat, silver hair glinting in the dim light. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were sharp, watchful. It took me a moment to recognize him. Judge Harold Green. My mother had spoken of him often, an old friend from her civic board days, a man she trusted. He stood silently, his gaze locked on Charles, his expression grave. The sight froze Charles mid-motion, his hand still raised. For a heartbeat, the cemetery was suspended between violence and reckoning. My breath caught. Pain throbbed through every inch of me, but hope flickered like the candles on the coffin. Someone had seen. Someone with power, with authority, had witnessed the truth. Charles lowered his arm slowly, trying to mask his fury with a veneer of composure, but it was too late. The judge had already seen the predator behind the polished exterior. Clara's smirk faltered for just an instant as her eyes followed mine to the man in the shadows. The funeral had ended, but something else had begun. That night was not just about grief, it became the first moment of a battle I could no longer avoid. The image of Judge Green watching silent yet unyielding etched itself into my mind. I knew then that my stepfather's reign of intimidation would not go unchallenged forever. My ribs ached, my knees bled, but my spirit bruised, though it was sparked with defiance. My name is Anna Whitmore. I was beaten black and blue for singing at my mother's funeral. My stepsister sneered, but the judge was watching, and that changed everything. My name is Anna Whitmore, and before that night at the cemetery, my life had already been carved by grief and control. My father, Robert Whitmore, died when I was only 7 years old. I remember his warm laugh, the way he carried me on his shoulders through the orchard behind our old house, the smell of sawdust from his workshop clinging to his clothes. His death left a hole that could not be filled, but my mother Elizabeth tried to stitch our world back together. She was strong, gentle, and determined to give me a safe home. When she married Charles Whitmore years later, she believed she was bringing stability back into our lives. Charles was older, wealthy, polished, and persuasive. He ran a real estate company with a reputation for success. To outsiders, he seemed like a savior for a widow and her daughter. To me, behind closed doors, he became a cage. He treated me not as family, but as an inconvenience, a reminder that my mother had once belonged to someone else. The first time he snapped at me, I was 12, just for humming while setting the table. He said I was disruptive, disrespectful, and I learned then that silence was safer than sound. Over the years, that silence became a shroud. Charles had a daughter of his own, Clara, 2 years younger than me. She was spoiled with gifts, vacations, and constant praise. While I was told to mind my manners, Clara was encouraged to shine. If she wanted new clothes, she got them. If she failed a class, Charles blamed the teacher. If I aced an exam, Charles dismissed it as luck. Clara learned quickly that siding with her father brought rewards, and soon she delighted in mocking me, calling me the stray, the outsider, the guest who never left. My mother tried to protect me. She whispered late at night that I was worthy, that my father would have been proud. She tucked notes into my school bag telling me she loved me, but her warmth was not enough to stop Charles from tightening his grip. By the time I turned 18, he had cut off my access to the small trust fund my father left. He said he would manage it better and that I was too young to understand finances. When I questioned him, he snapped that money was wasted on me, that I should be grateful he allowed me to stay under his roof. I went to college with scholarships and part-time jobs scraping by while Clara drove a new car and lived in a sorority house paid by her father. Every phone call home was a battle. Charles criticized my choices, demanded to know why I studied literature instead of something useful, mocked my dream of becoming a writer. Clara joined the chorus, sending me pictures of her vacations while sneering that I was poor, that I would end up begging. Through all of it, my mother remained my anchor. She told me to endure, that she would protect my inheritance, that the house we lived in belonged to me as much as to her. But then cancer came like a thief. It stole her energy, her smile, and finally her life. Watching her fade was the hardest pain I had ever known. And through it all, Charles reminded me how much he sacrificed, how he paid the medical bills, how he alone understood responsibility. He used her illness as leverage, telling me that if I wanted her to be comfortable, I had to comply with his demands. I did not argue. I just stayed quiet, holding my mother's hand, watching the light leave her eyes. The day she died, Charles told me flatly that the estate would be under his management. Clara hugged him as if she had won a prize. I felt like a guest at my own mother's funeral. After she was gone, the house grew colder. Charles locked the finances completely, telling me he would give me an allowance if I behaved. He restricted my movements, demanded to know where I went, insisted that family reputation mattered more than my independence. I tried to escape through work, but even there his shadow reached. He would call employers pretending concern, but dropping hints that I was unstable. He would remind me that I owed him for keeping me under his roof. My stepsister never missed a chance to remind me that I was dependent. She laughed at my second-hand clothes, my small apartment when I finally moved out my modest job at the publishing office. When I visited home, she called me a parasite. At night, I lay awake, replaying my mother's voice, trying to hold on to her encouragement. But the weight of gaslighting pressed down. Charles told me repeatedly that I was too sensitive, that he only corrected me because he cared. When he raised his hand and struck me, he said it was to teach me discipline. When he locked me out in the rain for missing curfew, he said it was for my own good. He painted cruelty as care until I began to doubt myself. Was I overreacting? Was I truly worthless? Those questions gnawed at me until my mother's funeral. That day, I tried to reclaim a fragment of myself by singing for her, by lifting my voice one last time. The violence that followed was not new, but it was public, undeniable, and witnessed. For years, Charles had told me that no one would believe me that family business stayed within walls. Clara reinforced it with sneers and laughter. But when the judge's eyes met mine across the graveyard, when I saw recognition in his gaze, I realized my stepfather's fortress of intimidation was not impenetrable. My body carried bruises, my ribs ached, but for the first time in years, my spirit whispered that maybe, just maybe, I was not alone. In the weeks after the funeral, I lived like a ghost drifting between work at the small publishing office and the dim apartment I rented downtown. Grief clung to me like damp clothes, heavy and suffocating. Yet beneath the grief, something else stirred, a sharper edge of suspicion that grew louder each day. My mother had been careful, meticulous about her affairs. She kept folders labeled in neat handwriting, every bill paid on time, every insurance form signed. She had once told me that when her time came, she wanted no chaos left behind for me. But after the funeral, Charles announced that he was the executor of the estate and that there was little left, only debts and obligations. His words did not match the woman I knew. Late one night, unable to sleep, I returned to the house. Not the grand mansion Charles boasted about in town, but the original family home my mother had inherited from her parents. It smelled of cedar and dust, and memories pulsed in every corner. I crept into her study, where the mahogany desk still held the faint scent of her lavender lotion. My hands shook as I pulled open drawers. At first, I found nothing but stationery and old photographs. Then, hidden beneath a stack of recipe books, I discovered an envelope addressed in my mother's handwriting. It was brittle at the edges, sealed with wax, and inside were copies of documents she had wanted me to have. A will. My heart pounded as I read the lines. The house, the savings account, even her personal jewelry collection were designated to me her only daughter. There was no mention of Charles. The date was only a year old, well within her illness, meaning she had been deliberate in making sure I was provided for. Yet Charles had said nothing about this. He had claimed authority over everything. My pulse quickened as I realized he must have hidden it, suppressing its existence to gain control. I stuffed the documents into my bag and hurried back to my apartment, every step echoing with fear that he would discover me. Over the next days, I examined the will alongside bank statements that had been mailed mistakenly to my old address. I noticed transfers large and irregular moving funds from my mother's account into entities I did not recognize. Mercer Holdings, Whitmore Consulting Ridgeview Properties. The names sounded generic, but each transaction was signed under Charles's authority. The amounts were suspiciously just below reporting thresholds, a trick I had read about in fraud cases. I knew then that this was not just grief clouding my mind, it was theft. The clarity hit me like cold water. My mother's legacy was being siphoned away. Still, I was only one woman, inexperienced and isolated. How could I fight a man who had lawyers' money and influence at his disposal? The answer came unexpectedly one afternoon when I visited the local library to return a stack of novels my mother had once loved. Behind the counter was a familiar face, Martha Lewis, a woman with auburn hair streaked with gray and eyes that carried warmth. She had been a close friend of my mother's during their years on the civic board, now working as a legal consultant. We embraced, tears welling as she expressed her sorrow. When she asked how I was holding up, something inside me cracked. I told her about the will, about the strange transfers, about the suffocating sense that Charles had stolen more than just my security. Martha listened without interruption, then leaned forward and spoke with quiet certainty. "Anna," she said, "I have seen this pattern before. Predatory spouses manipulating estates, hiding assets, creating shell companies to funnel money." She explained that if I had documents and could establish a timeline, there was a chance to contest his actions legally. Her words were like oxygen to me. For the first time, I felt less like a helpless child and more like someone standing at the edge of a path forward. We arranged to meet later at her office. That evening, under the glow of a single desk lamp, I laid out everything I had found, spreading papers across her glass table. She scanned the will, the statements, the transfers. She asked pointed questions about dates and signatures. Her brow furrowed, then she nodded gravely. "These are not mistakes, Anna. These are deliberate moves to strip you of your inheritance. If we can trace them to his accounts, we can prove mismanagement and fraud." My chest tightened with both fear and hope. Charles had always told me that the law was on his side, that no judge would take the word of an emotional girl over a respected businessman. Yet here was a seasoned lawyer telling me otherwise. Clara, of course, continued her cruelty. When I encountered her by chance at a cafe, she smirked, waved her manicured nails, and mocked my modest outfit. She leaned in and hissed that no one believed me that Charles had already arranged everything. Her sneer reignited my resolve. I realized that her arrogance stemmed from blind faith in her father's invincibility. That arrogance might be her undoing. Over the next weeks, I worked with Martha to gather more evidence. I began requesting copies of property deeds and corporate filings at the county office. Many were public records available to anyone willing to dig. My stomach twisted as I read line after line linking Charles to companies registered at the same P.O. box, all incorporated within months of my mother's diagnosis. The timing was no coincidence. My hands shook as I photocopied the documents, carefully labeling each one with dates. At night, the memories of my mother's voice urged me forward. She had trusted me to guard her legacy. Every discovery felt like both a betrayal and a vindication. I sometimes cried until I was hoarse, then steadied myself with the thought that justice required endurance. During one of our meetings, Martha revealed that she had already noticed Charles's name in other financial complaints from previous cases. He had a history of skating close to the line using intimidation to silence opponents. But now, with me determined and armed with documents, the cracks in his empire were widening. The truth no longer whispered, it screamed from every page. I was terrified of what he would do if he discovered my investigation, yet a fire had been lit inside me. For years, I had lived in silence, convinced that resistance was pointless. But the will in my bag, the bank statements on Martha's desk, and the certainty in her voice told me otherwise. This was not just grief speaking. This was evidence, and evidence was power. The discovery of the will and the fraudulent transfers ignited something fierce inside me. I had spent most of my life shrinking in Charles's shadow, silenced by his booming voice and by Clara's constant sneers. But now that I held proof in my hands, silence no longer felt safe. It felt complicit. I promised myself that my mother's legacy would not be buried under forged signatures and shell companies. The first step was learning how to protect myself. Martha taught me the basics of documentation. Every conversation, every threatening remark, every shred of evidence had to be preserved with precision. I bought a small digital recorder that fit in my pocket, and the first time Charles cornered me in the hallway of the house, demanding to know why I kept visiting the county clerk's office, I slid the switch on. His words poured out exactly as I knew they would, filled with threats disguised as advice. He told me to stop prying, that curiosity would destroy me, that family loyalty mattered more than laws. I kept my face blank, nodding as if I agreed, while inside my chest my heart hammered with adrenaline. When I got back to my apartment, I saved the file to a hidden folder, then uploaded it to a secure cloud drive Martha had helped me set up. Triple redundancy became my mantra. Each piece of evidence was stored on my laptop, my external drive, and the cloud. If Charles tried to destroy one, 2 others would survive. I began scanning old paperwork, utility bills, receipts with his signature. It was tedious, exhausting, but strangely empowering. For the first time, I felt like I had a weapon of my own. Around this time, I reconnected with Daniel Price, a college friend who had studied computer science. He was 29, soft-spoken, with a quiet intensity that made people underestimate him. When I explained the situation, he did not flinch. Instead, he leaned forward and said he could help recover deleted files from my mother's old laptop, the one Charles had shoved into storage after her death. Together, we retrieved emails that showed my mother had been corresponding with her attorney right up until the final weeks, making sure her estate was secure for me. One message even mentioned her suspicion that Charles was hiding documents. My throat tightened as I read her words, as if she were reaching through time to warn me. Daniel organized the recovered files into encrypted folders and gave me detailed instructions on how to use two-factor authentication. His calm explanations steadied me, and his presence reminded me that not everyone in my world wished me harm. The loneliness that had weighed on me for years began to lift. Meanwhile, in the attic of the family home, I unearthed a small music box my mother had kept hidden. Inside was a folded piece of paper, her handwriting faint but still clear. "Anna," it read, "if you are reading this, then you must continue. Trust the truth. Trust yourself. Do not be afraid to stand up." I pressed the note to my chest, tears spilling down my face. It felt like she was still guiding me. I promised her aloud that I would not back down. The days that followed were a careful dance between fear and determination. Charles grew more suspicious. He noticed that I carried my bag closer, that I kept my phone locked. He barked questions about my schedule, demanded to know who I was meeting. Clara laughed whenever she saw me scribbling notes, taunting that I looked like a paranoid detective in a cheap drama. But their cruelty only sharpened my focus. Each insult became fuel. I created a timeline on my wall, pinning receipts, statements, and emails in order. The pattern of fraud emerged like a spider web, all threads leading back to Charles. Martha visited often, guiding me on which documents would stand in court and which were simply background. She warned me that once Charles realized how much I knew, he would lash out harder than ever. That thought chilled me, but it also made me more cautious. I varied my routines, checked my rearview mirror, and kept Daniel and Martha updated about my whereabouts. I began practicing what I would say if confronted, rehearsing calm replies while secretly recording. Each step was a form of preparation, not just legally, but emotionally. I was building armor piece by piece against the storm I knew was coming. Clara's mockery escalated. At a family dinner, she raised her glass and toasted to loyalty, her eyes locked on me with a smirk. I smiled back politely, my recorder humming in my pocket, capturing every veiled insult. When Charles growled that family secrets must stay buried, I knew I had just gained another piece of evidence. The more they tried to intimidate me, the more material they handed me. It was ironic, almost poetic. At night, exhaustion pressed heavy, but when I looked at the note from my mother and the growing wall of proof, I felt her strength echoing through me. I was no longer just enduring abuse, I was preparing for a fight. Each day brought me closer to the inevitable confrontation, but this time I would not be defenseless. I was gathering allies, sharpening tools, and bracing myself for the storm. And deep inside, I knew one thing with unshakable certainty. I would not let Charles or Clara erase me. Not this time. The night of the family dinner at the Whitmore estate felt like walking into an enemy stronghold. The grand dining room was drenched in golden light from the chandelier, the mahogany table polished to a mirror-shine silverware arranged with military precision. I sat at one end, my hands folded tightly in my lap to hide the tremor of anticipation. Charles presided at the head, like a monarch surveying his kingdom, his voice booming as he recounted stories of business triumphs. Clara lounged beside him, swirling her wine, her eyes darting to me with mocking delight. She wore a crimson dress, striking and smug as though this evening were a performance and I was the entertainment. Dinner began with small talk, but beneath every word throbbed tension. Charles spoke of real estate deals, of properties rising in value, of the bright future for those who aligned themselves wisely. Clara chimed in, praising her father's foresight, laughing at his jokes with exaggerated devotion. When the main course arrived, Charles finally shifted the conversation. He cleared his throat and leaned forward, knife glinting in his hand as he sliced into his steak. "It is time," he declared, "that we discuss the estate. Your mother left behind obligations, debts, matters that require practical decisions." Clara smirked, already anticipating the outcome. She leaned toward me and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You should not get your hopes up, Anna. You are more like a guest here, not family." Heat surged in my chest, but I kept my expression calm. Under the table, my thumb slid against the recorder in my pocket, activating it with a practiced motion. The tiny red light blinked unseen, capturing every syllable. I lifted my gaze and asked softly, "What about the will?" Silence hung heavy. Charles's knife paused mid-cut. He looked up slowly, his eyes narrowing. What will he ask, feigning ignorance? My heart pounded, but I kept my voice steady. The will Mother signed last year, the one designating the house and her assets to me. His jaw tightened, a flicker of rage breaking through his facade. There is no such will, he snapped. Clara let out a sharp laugh, her voice dripping with mockery. You are delusional, Anna, always spinning fantasies. Charles banged his fist lightly against the table for emphasis, the sound echoing. This estate falls under my management, he declared. You have no rights here. I let the silence stretch, then leaned forward, eyes locked on his. The law will decide that, not you. His face darkened, the mask slipping further. He raised his voice, accusing me of betrayal, of daring to question his authority. Clara joined the chorus, her laughter rising as she pointed at me, calling me an outsider, a freeloader, a parasite clinging to scraps. Each word was venomous, designed to shred whatever confidence I had left. But I refused to shrink. I drew a slow breath and said firmly, You can sneer all you like, Clara, but facts do not bend to insults. And Charles, the more you deny, the deeper your lies will bury you. The words hit like stones. Charles surged up from his chair, looming over me, his shadow stretching across the table. You think you can challenge me, he hissed, leaning close. You have no idea the battles I have fought, the sacrifices I have made. I kept my gaze level, though my heart thrashed. Sacrifices, I repeated quietly. You mean the money you siphoned through shell companies? His face twisted, veins standing out in his neck. Clara gasped theatrically, pressing a hand to her mouth as though my accusation were outrageous, then burst into cruel laughter. You really have lost your mind, she said, grinning as she sipped her wine. Charles's voice dropped to a low growl. If you continue this path, you will regret it. I recorded every word, my hand steady on my lap. Outwardly, I kept my expression calm, though adrenaline coursed through me. I knew this confrontation was dangerous, that his temper could explode at any second, but I also knew I had cornered him in a way he had not expected. I looked directly at Clara and said, You call me an outsider, yet it is your father who is stealing from the family he claims to protect. Her smirk faltered just slightly enough to show a crack in her confidence. Charles pointed a finger in my face, shaking with fury. You will not win, he roared. I leaned back, my voice steady. It is not about winning, it is about truth. The truth always surfaces. His chair scraped violently against the floor as he shoved it back, storming away from the table. Clara followed her laughter echoing behind her, though I detected a nervous edge this time. I sat alone at the long, polished table, the remnants of the meal untouched before me, my recorder still humming quietly in my pocket. I exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment sinking in. This dinner had not been about food or family. It had been a battlefield, and I had refused to retreat. My ribs still ached from past blows, my heart still carried scars, but tonight I had drawn a line. I had faced Charles and Clara not as their victim, but as their challenger. And deep down, I knew they understood it. The war for my mother's legacy had truly begun. The confrontation at the dinner table had left a mark deeper than the bruises already modeling my skin. I knew Charles's temper. I knew the way his rage simmered until it boiled over, and by standing my ground, I had guaranteed retaliation. Days passed in a haze of tension. I avoided the estate as much as possible, but one evening I returned to retrieve a box of my mother's belongings. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that prickles your skin. I should have known it was a trap. Charles was waiting in the living room, the firelight casting jagged shadows across his face. Clara lounged on the sofa, phone in hand, smirk already in place. I froze at the threshold, my pulse spiking, but forced my voice to stay even. I am only here for my mother's things. Charles rose slowly, his eyes glinting with malice. Your mother is gone, he said coldly. Her things belong to the family now. My stomach nodded. I am her family, I replied. The words were out before I could stop them, words that felt like defiance, words that carried weight. His hand clenched into a fist. Family, he spat. You are nothing but a burden I tolerated. Clara chuckled softly, lifting her phone to capture the scene. The sight of the camera made my blood run cold. This was not just cruelty, it was spectacle. I stepped back, but Charles moved forward in an instant, his bulk cutting off my escape. He shoved me hard against the wall, the air whooshing from my lungs. Pain exploded in my ribs where old bruises had barely healed. I cried out, but the sound was swallowed by the crackling fire. Clara leaned forward, her phone steady. "Say hi to the world," she sneered. "They should see what a pathetic liar you are." Her laughter sliced deeper than the blow. Charles's hand shot out, gripping my arm so tight I thought bone might snap. "You think you can humiliate me in my own house," he bellowed. "You dare accuse me of theft, of fraud." His spit flecked my cheek as he shook me, my head slamming lightly against the plaster. Stars burst in my vision. I gasped for breath, every nerve screaming, but somewhere deep inside, a spark of defiance burned. Through clenched teeth, I forced the words, "Everything is recorded." His grip tightened. "What did you say? I coughed, tasting copper." I said, "Everything is recorded." Clara's smirk faltered just slightly, her phone lowering for a fraction of a second. Charles's eyes narrowed, suspicion clouding his fury. "Lies," he growled. "You have nothing." I straightened as best I could, ignoring the fire in my ribs. "I have enough, more than enough." His face twisted, rage consuming him. He shoved me to the ground, my knees scraping against the hardwood. Pain flared, but I clutched my bag close where my recorder hummed, capturing every word, every threat. Clara's voice rang out shrill and mocking. "Look at her daddy! Look how pathetic she is! Nobody will ever believe her!" The two of them towered over me, predator and accomplice. My chest heaved, each breath ragged, but my mind sharpened. I thought of my mother's note, of Martha's calm instructions, of Daniel's reassurance that data cannot be erased once it is backed up. They could bruise my body, but the truth was safe beyond their reach. Charles crouched low, his face inches from mine, breath hot with fury. "I will bury you in lawsuits," he hissed. "I will make sure no employer touches you, no court listens to you. You will vanish." I met his gaze despite the terror crawling through me. "Do your worst," I whispered. "The truth will surface." For a moment, he stared as if trying to decipher whether I truly meant it. Then, with a roar, he slammed his fist into the wall beside my head, plaster cracking. I flinched, heart hammering, but refused to cry out. Clara laughed again, but the sound wavered, tinged with unease. She zoomed in with her phone, yet her hands trembled ever so slightly. Charles finally straightened his chest, heaving. He spat on the floor near me, then stormed toward the door. "You are finished, Anna? Finished." He vanished into the hallway, his heavy footsteps pounding upstairs. Clara lingered a moment longer, her sneer faltering. She leaned down, whispering so close I felt her breath. "You cannot win," she said. "He will crush you." She snapped her phone shut and followed him. I lay on the floor, pain radiating from every joint, my breath ragged. Tears pricked my eyes, but I swallowed them. Instead, I fumbled into my bag, retrieved the recorder, and watched the small blinking light. Relief surged through me. Every word, every threat, every insult had been preserved. I whispered to myself, "He gave me more evidence. He thinks he broke me, but he gave me more." My body trembled violently as I forced myself upright. Each step toward the door felt like dragging a boulder, but I would not collapse here, not under their roof. The night air hit me like ice as I staggered outside. I cradled my ribs, clutching the recorder to my chest, my lifeline. The humiliation cut deep, but beneath it burned something stronger. They wanted me to feel hopeless, to feel isolated. Instead, they had handed me ammunition. My bruises would fade, but the recording would last forever. That night, I limped back to my apartment and uploaded the file to every secure channel I had. The cloud, the backup drive, the encrypted folder Daniel had built. I labeled it with the date and a single phrase, "Proof they cannot deny." As the file transferred, I sat at my kitchen table, pain searing through me, but a grim smile tugged at my lips. The escalation I had feared had come. Charles had crossed another line, Clara had joined him in cruelty, but their arrogance blinded them. They thought violence would silence me. Instead, it gave me more truth, more reason, more fire. And deep in my battered chest, I knew the war was far from over. It was only beginning. The morning of the first court hearing dawned gray and heavy, the sky hanging low as though it too sensed the weight of the day. My ribs still ached from Charles's attack, faint bruises tracing ugly patterns across my skin beneath the fabric of my blouse. But I stood straighter than I had in years. I was not walking into the courthouse as a frightened girl anymore. I was walking in as my mother's daughter, armed with evidence and allies. Martha walked beside me, her leather briefcase swinging with purpose. She had spent weeks preparing, cross-referencing every transfer, every company registration, every receipt I had salvaged from drawers and dusty boxes. Daniel followed close behind, carrying a laptop, his quiet presence grounding me. The courthouse steps were crowded with attorneys and clerks, the hum of whispered strategy filling the air. My heart pounded, but I forced my breathing steady. When we entered the courtroom, the scent of polished wood and paper hit me. The judge's bench loomed high, and my chest clenched when I recognized the man seated there. Judge Harold Green. His silver hair gleamed under the lights, his expression stern but familiar. Memories of seeing him at the funeral flooded back the way he had watched in silence as Charles's fury erupted. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and though his expression did not shift, I sensed recognition. Across the aisle, Charles sat with his attorney, a sleek man in an expensive suit who whispered constantly into his ear. Charles wore the mask of respectability again, his tie straight, his expression composed, but his eyes flickered with barely suppressed rage. Clara sat beside him dressed elegantly, her chin raised in smug confidence. She glanced at me with a smirk, as though certain the day would end with me humiliated. The proceedings began with formalities, but when Martha rose to present our case, the room shifted. She laid out the evidence with precision, her voice calm yet piercing. She introduced the will signed and dated with clear stipulations in my favor. She displayed the bank transfers, each one strategically under reporting limits, each one tied to shell companies registered under Charles's name. Daniel projected charts on the screen showing the circular flow of funds, a spiderweb that trapped itself. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom as the pattern became undeniable. Charles's attorney objected, claiming coincidence, claiming misinterpretation, but Martha countered with dates, signatures, and corroborating documents. Then she introduced the recordings. My pulse raced as my own voice filled the courtroom speakers, timid but steady as Charles threatened me, his words dripping with venom. Gasps erupted when the second clip played, capturing Clara's mocking laughter as her father's rage left me bruised. I clenched my hands in my lap, forcing myself to breathe while the world heard what I had endured for years. Judge Green's gaze never wavered. His pen scratched notes, his eyes moving between me, the recordings, and Charles. At last, Charles could not contain himself. He shot to his feet, voice booming, claiming manipulation, claiming I was ungrateful that I was twisting family matters into a circus. His attorney tugged at his sleeve, urging restraint, but the mask slipped fully. The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore. This is my courtroom, not your dining table." The authority in Green's voice silenced even Clara, whose smirk faltered. My heart surged. For years, Charles's word had been law in my life, but here his power crumbled under the weight of truth and authority. When it was my turn to testify, my legs trembled, but I forced myself forward. I spoke of my childhood, of my mother's efforts to shield me of the years of intimidation and isolation. My voice broke when I recounted the funeral, but I steadied myself, reminding myself that every tear was evidence too proof of the harm done. I described the discovery of the will, the suspicious transfers, the threats, the attack. Each detail was backed by documents and recordings, no longer just my word against his. Clara rolled her eyes dramatically, whispering to her father's lawyer, but Judge Green's warning glance silenced her again. The courtroom was no longer Charles's stage. It was mine. When Martha concluded with a request for an immediate freeze on the estate's assets to prevent further theft, the tension was palpable. The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers, his eyes fixed on Charles. "Mr. Whitmore," he said slowly, This court is presented with substantial evidence of fiduciary misconduct, coercion, and abuse. The transfer patterns alone raise grave concerns, and the recordings are damning. Therefore, I am granting the motion. Effective immediately, all estate assets are frozen pending full investigation. A collective gasp filled the room. Charles's face turned crimson, his mouth opening to protest, but Judge Green raised a hand. Do not test this court further. You have been warned. Clara's face drained of color, her confidence evaporating as she realized the implications. Without access to the estate's money, their carefully constructed facade would crack. For me, it was more than a legal victory. It was a vindication, a public acknowledgement that I was not invisible, not insane, not powerless. I had faced them, presented the truth, and the law had listened. As the session adjourned, Charles glared at me with pure hatred. His jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. Clara muttered under her breath, venom lacing every word, but I barely heard. My pulse roared with the knowledge that for the first time in years, the tide had turned. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Local reporters had caught wind of the case, curious about whispers of fraud and family scandal. Martha shielded me, guiding me quickly down the steps, but I caught a glimpse of Charles's furious face as he was surrounded by questions. His polished mask was crumbling, and the world was beginning to see the man behind it. That night in my apartment, I sat at my desk exhausted but unable to sleep. My body still ached, my heart still bruised, but I felt stronger than I ever had. I opened the music box once more, reading my mother's note in her delicate handwriting. Trust the truth. Do not be afraid. I whispered into the quiet. I am not afraid anymore. For years, Charles had convinced me that no one would ever believe me, that the law would side with him, that I was powerless. Today proved him wrong. Today showed that even predators can stumble when the light shines on their shadows. And this was only the beginning. The war for justice had officially moved into the open, and I was ready to see it through. The weeks that followed the first court session were a whirlwind of revelations, hearings, and headlines. Charles had always carried himself like an untouchable patriarch, the kind of man whose money and connections could smooth over any scandal. But now the cracks in his empire spread faster than he could patch them. The emergency freeze on the estate meant that every dollar he had tried to hide was under scrutiny. Investigators began combing through his shell companies, pulling records, tracing wires. For once, the financial maze he had built was working against him. Each loop, each false invoice, each cleverly disguised transfer became another nail in the coffin of his credibility. I watched it unfold from the back of the courtroom as Martha presented evidence piece by piece. She moved like a strategist, patient and precise, while Daniel supplied digital records to back every claim. The judge listened with unwavering attention, his gavel punctuating objections from Charles's increasingly desperate lawyer. Then came the turning point. The video Clara had recorded of me being assaulted, the one she had mocked me with, somehow surfaced online. I never learned if she posted it in arrogance or if someone leaked it, but the effect was immediate. At first, the video showed me being shoved and struck, my face twisted in pain. Clara's voice could be heard laughing, egging her father on. At the end, my voice whispered clearly, "Everything is recorded." The clip spread like wildfire across social media. Strangers commented in outrage, condemning both Charles's violence and Clara's cruelty. The image of her sneering while I lay bruised on the floor burned into the public consciousness. The Whitmore family name, once associated with power and wealth, now became synonymous with disgrace. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered with signs reading, "Justice for Anna." I had never felt so exposed, yet so vindicated. For years, I had been told my pain was invisible. Now the world saw it. Charles's lawyer tried to spin it, claiming the video was taken out of context, claiming I had provoked him. But the judge was not swayed. Context cannot excuse violence. Judge Green said firmly, his voice echoing through the chamber. This court does not tolerate abuse. Clara tried to maintain her facade of superiority, arriving in designer clothes, her chin tilted arrogantly, but I could see the fear creeping into her eyes. At one session, a reporter shouted a question about her laughter in the video, and she snapped, cursing on camera. That outburst made the evening news, her face frozen mid-sneer beneath the caption, "Step Family Scandal." The consequences spread beyond courtrooms and headlines. Business partners began distancing themselves from Charles, pulling out of deals, citing concerns about reputation. The bank called in loans, unwilling to be tied to fraud. Neighbors whispered friends vanished. The fortress of influence he had relied upon was collapsing brick by brick. Inside the courtroom, the moment of reckoning came when Judge Green read the ruling. Charles Whitmore, he said, you are hereby charged with domestic violence, fiduciary misconduct, and financial fraud. The estate assets will remain frozen pending criminal proceedings. Furthermore, this court orders that the primary residence, the family home of Elizabeth Whitmore, be returned to the rightful beneficiary, Anna Whitmore. The words hit like a bell toll. My mother's house was safe, her legacy preserved. My knees trembled, but I stood tall. Across the aisle, Charles exploded, his face purple with rage. "This is a farce," he bellowed, slamming his fist on the table. "I sacrificed everything for this family. I earned every dollar. You cannot take it from me." Bailiffs moved quickly surrounding him as he ranted, spittle flying. Clara clutched his arm, her composure shattered. "Father, stop!" she hissed, but he shook her off. The judge's gavel thundered. "Order! Mr. Whitmore, you will be removed if you cannot control yourself." Charles glared at me with pure hatred. "You think you have won, Anna. You think this is over, but I will destroy you." His words rang out before two officers seized his arms and escorted him from the courtroom. The sight of him being dragged away, his once polished image reduced to a shouting criminal, seared itself into my memory. For years, I had been the one cowering under his power. Now it was him who stumbled powerless against the weight of truth. Clara sat frozen, her eyes wide, her hands trembling. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked. And I, standing quietly with Martha's steady hand on my shoulder, felt the tide shift irrevocably. That night, the news carried the footage of Charles being escorted out, his face contorted with rage. Commentators dissected the case, calling it a landmark and holding wealthy abusers accountable. Social media lit up with messages of support for me. Strangers shared their own stories, thanking me for speaking out. It was overwhelming, but it was also healing. The scars on my ribs still throbbed, but my spirit no longer bent under silence. Clara faced her own reckoning. Friends abandoned, her invitations dried up. She was mocked online, her laughter at my pain replayed endlessly. At first, she lashed out, calling the world unfair, but eventually she grew quiet, her arrogance replaced with shame. I did not gloat. Justice was never about humiliation. It was about truth. Yet I could not deny the satisfaction of seeing the consequences land where they belonged. For once, the scales balanced, however briefly. Judge Green addressed the courtroom in closing remarks that etched themselves into me. "Justice has eyes," he said, "and justice has ears. No matter how carefully lies are woven, the truth finds its way through." Today, this court affirms that no one is above the law. His words resounded with the finality of a verdict and the promise of a future. As I walked out of the courthouse into the waiting crowd of cameras and protesters, the sun broke through the clouds. Light spilled across the steps, warm against my face. For the first time in years, I lifted my head high. Charles was in custody, his empire crumbling. Clara's cruelty had been laid bare, and my mother's house was mine again. The consequences had arrived sharp and undeniable, and though the battle was not yet fully over, I knew the war for truth was being won. When the ruling secured my mother's house back into my hands, I felt as though a chain had been lifted from my shoulders. For years, that house had been a battleground filled with echoes of shouting and humiliation, but beneath the scars, it was still the place where I had once known love. I returned slowly, almost cautiously, unlocking the door with trembling fingers. The air inside was stale, the garden outside overgrown, but as sunlight filtered through the dusty curtains, I could almost hear my mother's laughter drifting from the kitchen. I set down my bag, closed my eyes, and whispered, "I brought it back, Mom." From that day forward, my focus shifted from fighting to rebuilding. At first, the house felt like a tomb, every corner reminding me of arguments, every creak of the stairs recalling footsteps heavy with rage. But then I opened the windows, scrubbed the floors, painted the walls, and little by little the house began to breathe again. I stepped into the backyard where weeds choked the flower beds, the same garden my mother once tended every morning. The soil was dry, the roses long dead, but I knelt anyway and began pulling weeds, my hands blistering, yet my heart lighter. Over time, green shoots returned a promise of life reborn. I found allies in unexpected places. Daniel visited often bringing tools and helping repair the cracked fences. His quiet presence steadied me, his patience teaching me that not every raised voice meant danger. Martha came on weekends, her sleeves rolled up as she helped me sort through boxes of old belongings. She never charged a dime for the hours she spent telling me this was more than a case. This was justice for a friend she had once loved dearly. Neighbors I barely knew dropped off casseroles and plants, telling me they had seen the news and admired my courage. Slowly, the house filled not with shadows, but with warmth. One afternoon, while unpacking a box of my mother's journals, I found a note tucked between the pages. It was written in her looping hand, dated only months before she passed. Anna, you are stronger than you believe. The world may try to silence you, but your voice is powerful. Promise me you will never let fear define you. Tears blurred the words as I pressed the paper to my chest. It felt like she had been guiding me every step, leaving breadcrumbs of hope even as her body failed. The process of healing was not easy. Some nights I still woke, sweating memories of Charles's fists replaying like a cruel film. Loud noises made me flinch. The sound of footsteps on hardwood made my stomach tighten. But I forced myself to face those fears. I kept a journal, pouring every memory onto paper, refusing to let silence rot inside me. Daniel encouraged me to attend a support group, and though my voice shook the first time I spoke, sharing my story brought relief I had not expected. I was not alone, and neither were they. Letters began to arrive, too. Most were from strangers who had read about my case, offering prayers and thanks. But one letter stopped me cold. It was from Clara. The handwriting was shaky, the words uneven. She wrote that she had been blinded by loyalty to her father, that she had mocked me out of jealousy and fear, that she was sorry. She admitted the video had been her greatest shame, that seeing herself laughing while I cried had broken something inside her. She begged for forgiveness, though she said she knew she did not deserve it. I read the letter again and again, emotions clashing inside me. Part of me wanted to tear it apart, to spit back the pain she had caused. But another part remembered my mother's teachings, that bitterness chains you as tightly as abuse. I did not reply, not yet. Forgiveness is not a gift to be rushed. It is a journey, and I was still walking mine. Still, I placed the letter in the music box with my mother's note, a reminder that even the cruel can sometimes awaken to their sins. In the evenings, I would sit in the garden. As the sun dipped low, the flowers slowly reclaiming their beauty. I often read my mother's letters aloud, letting her words mingle with the rustle of leaves. The pain had not vanished, but it no longer defined me. My ribs healed, the bruises faded, but the true healing came from knowing I had reclaimed not just a house, but a life. One day, Daniel brought over a small oak tree sapling. He handed me the pot and said simply, "This will grow stronger every year, just like you." Together, we dug a hole in the center of the yard and planted it. As I covered the roots with soil, I felt a surge of peace. Life was moving forward, roots taking hold, branches reaching upward. Martha suggested we host a small gathering to celebrate the victory not in court, but in the heart of the home my mother had loved. So neighbors, friends, and even some colleagues came with food and laughter. Children ran through the garden, music played softly, and for the first time in years, the house was filled with joy instead of fear. As the night ended, I stood in the doorway watching candles flicker on the tables outside, and I thought of how far I had come from that night at the cemetery. Healing was not about erasing the past, but about choosing what to carry forward. I chose my mother's love, my allies' support, and the knowledge that I had survived. I chose to plant gardens instead of dwelling in ruins. When I finally closed the door behind me, I knew the house was no longer haunted by cruelty. It had become a sanctuary once more, a place where I could grow without fear. And though Clara's apology remained unanswered, it was part of the story too, a reminder that even broken families sometimes glimpse the truth. but forgiveness, like healing, would arrive in its own time. For now, I cherished the peace that had finally returned and the strength that had bloomed from pain. The final chapter of this journey did not come in a courtroom nor in a shouted confrontation, but in the quiet rhythm of ordinary days when fear no longer governed my every breath. Standing in the garden one crisp morning, the sunlight stretched over rows of roses I had replanted, their petals shimmering with dew. I breathed deeply, the air carrying both the scent of earth and the faint sweetness of blossoms. It felt as if the house itself had exhaled no longer a prison but a sanctuary. I whispered aloud, "Mom, it is safe now. The house is safe. I am safe, and your voice still echoes in me." My mother had been gone for months, yet her presence seemed stitched into every corner of the home. Her notes, her music box, even her worn gardening gloves resting on the windowsill reminded me daily that love endures beyond absence. I often sat beneath the oak tree Daniel and I planted, its small leaves already stretching skyward, a living monument to resilience. Life began to reshape itself. Daniel became more than a friend, his patience and loyalty weaving into the fabric of my healing. He never pressed me, never demanded more than I could give, but slowly, gently, he reminded me that trust could be rebuilt. Martha remained my shield and mentor, guiding me not only through legal knots, but through the rough terrain of learning to stand tall in my own life. Neighbors became friends, friends became family. I was no longer isolated, yet there were nights when memories returned unbidden. The sound of Charles's rage, the sting of his blows, the sight of Clara's laughter, they would surface like shadows at the edges of light. But instead of breaking me, they served as reminders of what I had overcome. Trauma became part of my story, not the end of it. I chose to carry it as a scar, not a wound. The legal aftermath of Charles's downfall was long and complex. He was indicted on multiple counts, from domestic violence to financial fraud to falsifying records. The Medicare scheme investigators uncovered carried heavy federal penalties. His empire, once intimidating, collapsed under the weight of truth. Clara was not charged criminally, but socially she paid a steep price. She withdrew from public life, her name tarnished by her own recorded cruelty. Months later, another letter arrived, this one longer, filled with regret. She admitted she had been blinded by comfort, manipulated by her father, and that she could no longer deny the harm she had caused. I read it by lamplight, my hands trembling. This time I did not feel rage, only sorrow for the years wasted. Forgiveness still eluded me, but compassion flickered. Perhaps one day I would meet her halfway. For now, distance was mercy. Healing unfolded in unexpected ways. I began writing again, something I had abandoned under Charles's derision. Words flowed late into the night, not just about my story, but about resilient survival and the quiet strength of women who refused to remain silent. To my surprise, a local paper published an essay I wrote, and readers reached out with their own stories. The act of giving voice to pain transformed it into purpose. I started volunteering at a shelter for women, helping others navigate the same fear I had once lived in. Each story I heard reminded me that silence only feeds cruelty and that sharing truth can light paths out of darkness. My garden flourished alongside these new beginnings. Roses bloomed, lilies stretched tall, and the oak grew stronger. The house was no longer a symbol of battles lost, but of resilience won. On evenings when the wind carried the scent of blossoms, I would sit on the porch, close my eyes, and imagine my mother beside me. I often spoke aloud to her, telling her of victories and stumbles of laughter shared with friends, of peace reclaimed. One evening, as twilight draped the garden in gold, I whispered, "Mother, they cannot hurt me anymore. I have done what you asked. I have protected our home, and I have found my voice." The breeze stirred as though she answered. The story of Charles and Clara was never about just one family. It was about the way power twists when unchecked, about the dangers of silence, about the courage required to resist. My journey had been one of blood and bruises, but also of resilience and truth. Standing tall in the aftermath, I knew the most important victory was not in court papers or frozen assets, but in reclaiming my own identity. The ending I offer you listening now is not a fairy tale. It is not free of scars or shadows, but it is real and it is hopeful. My life has shifted from fear to strength, from silence to voice. I am Anna Whitmore, and though I was beaten black and blue for singing at my mother's funeral, though my stepsister sneered, and my stepfather tried to erase me, I endured. The judge listened, the truth prevailed, and I found my way back to myself. To everyone hearing this, I ask you, what would you have done in my place? Would you have dared to stand against violence cloaked as family? Would you have spoken when silence seemed safer? These questions matter because silence allows cruelty to thrive. If my story resonates with you, if you have known pain, or if you have witnessed injustice, let this be a call. Share your thoughts, share your stories. Speak where you once stayed silent. Comment below, join the conversation, and let others know they are not alone. And if you have found strength in this journey, subscribe because more stories of truth and resilience deserve to be told. As I end, picture the garden, the oak tree rooted deeply, roses blooming, sunlight spilling across the soil. That is where I stand now, stronger, unbroken, my mother's voice forever in my heart. And I invite you to stand with me in the light of truth, in the resilience of survivors, and in the certainty that justice, though slow, will always find its way.